Welcome to the Kent Lap Podcast.
Todd Engstrom, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you, and it's good to meet you. We talked a few years ago, and then we talked again recently, and I'm happy to be in your city, and I'm happy to meet you face to face.
In person is always great, especially in the season we're in right now. So
Totally agree. Did I pronounce your last name properly?
you did indeed. It's
Okay.
Swedish, but it's been totally Americanized. So
Really?
yeah, it means meadow stream, believe it or not.
Oh, yeah?
So it's very peaceful and calm, which is not my personality. so-
Okay, but you have a peaceful and calm look about you, though, about your face. I mean, I bet there's plenty of energy and ambition underneath it, because some people have that gift where they've got that inward, but they emit sort of a peace and calm. And I feel like in the 3.5 minutes that I've met you, that you're one of those guys.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm an Enneagram 1, so underneath the surface, there's a lot of rage and anger that exists there. So
Okay,
don't be fooled.
What's a 1 on the Enneagram?
They're the reformer, so driven by a strong sense of right and wrong or righteousness. So, yes.
That's how a chemist gets into ministry, I guess. Huh?
We can talk a little bit more
we'll get
about
to
that
that,
indeed,
yeah.
but that is a big part of it.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And I would like to hear, well, give us a bit of an overview on yourself and who you are and what you're doing now. And then I'd like to hear a little bit about Austin as a city. I mean, there's lots of changes and growth and development happening here for sure. So, but I'd like to give the listeners a little bit of an overview on yourself first. Yeah,
so I'm a husband to my wife, Olivia. We've been married for 16 years, so our marriage can drive now, which is kind of fun. We have 5...
I never thought about it that way.
Still hasn't been evaluated yet, but according to the years, it could drive. But we have 5 kids. So our oldest is 13, our youngest is 5. So we are in the thick of parenthood. Mm-hmm. We've got a pubescent teenager in our home, and then a sweet little 5-year-old who's just kind and keeps us young and innocent. So. My role is a pastor at a church here in the city of Austin. It's called the Austin Stone Community Church, and I'm our executive pastor of ministry strategies, which is the longest title in the universe. Yeah. Which just basically means I do what needs to get done. I currently lead 4 different teams. I lead our communications team, so helping us think about how do we tell compelling stories and keep our body informed and inspired for all that God is doing in our midst. I lead our Austin Stone Institute, which trains Christian leaders for the church, city, and nations. And so we've tried to take maybe a church-based approach to seminary education and just create an environment where academic instruction is highly valued, but it's in the context of leadership in real, actual ministry. So,
yes.
I lead our For the City team, which is local mission. How are we engaging in opportunities to care for the poor, the orphan, and the widow? How do we minister to the marginalized? How do we pursue mercy and justice in the city of Austin? And then I lead our For the Nations team. So we have 142 long-term workers overseas, and we have a fairly highly developed strategic approach to how we're pursuing catalyzing church planting movements amongst unreached people groups. So those are kind of the 4 things that I spend my time doing. The majority of what I do, honestly, is invest in people. I build teams, I disciple leaders, and try to help them thrive in their life in Christ, but also in what God has called them to and flourish in the gifts that He's given them.
Yeah, wonderful, man. You've got a lot going on. How many people do you say you have overseas right now? 142?
142 currently.
Wow. How many? How big is the stone?
Pre-COVID, we would probably be around 8,100 people. That's adults, kids, and students on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think you are now? Is it hard to...
That is a tricky question to answer. We've gathered indoors, outdoors, and then we still continue to gather virtually. It would seem like the gathering strategy has allowed us to continue to connect well with our people. In-person gatherings were probably about 40% of the Sunday attendance prior to COVID. And we have a pretty good, strong attendance to our broadcast on Sunday mornings for people who choosing to worship in their homes.
Yep. If you add up the 40% in person plus the people tuning in online, does it come out to about that 8,100 mark? Or
I think it's a little bit more. I'd have to go back and do the math. I hate to be that guy who quotes wrong numbers because I'm a chemist and an executive pastor, so precision matters a ton to me, but I think we're a little bit more than what we entered into COVID with.
When did you guys open back up with any options for in-person, whether it was outdoors or indoors?
It was, I think, right around August or September, late August, early September. So we started that process in July. So we kind of took a very conservative approach. Just wanted to make sure we knew what we were getting into, that we were prayerful and discerning about it, that we had a degree of unity as to our approach within our leadership team specifically, and then slowly progress towards providing in-person gathering services. July also was the time at which COVID surged the most in Austin. So the date that we had chosen...
More than now?
More than now, yes.
Oh, wow.
So we are actually at stage 4, just the baseline of stage 4 and stage 3 in Austin's risk-based guidelines right now. And so, honestly, the weekend that we were going to do in-person services was almost at the height of the acceleration of cases in Austin. So we chose not to gather, delayed it for about 8 weeks. We kind of did it in 4-week chunks. We said, hey, we'll think about it, we'll pray about it, we'll consult medical professionals, we'll pay attention to our local governance as well as the state governance. And so we ended up, like, it was late August, I think, when we did.
Now, with a church that size, though, and you're over communication... having an in-person plan that weekend and then canceling it, that's like, I just picture kind of like turning a barge or like a big ship. Like, that's how communication works at large churches, right? I mean, you have to get as far in front of these things as possible and then have reminders along the way, and to make a last-minute change like that, I mean, I guess ultimately it's just putting out an announcement, right? But it's still, that would not be how you would normally like to communicate with a church this large.
That is very true. We have had to communicate a lot in a short period of time for an extended period of time at the Austin Stones. We've learned a ton about how to do that as effectively as we can. I still don't think that we're, excelling in the area of communication, particularly in keeping the body informed and participative. But we're doing the very best that we can in this season to keep them at least engaged and knowledgeable as to how and why we're making the decisions we're making.
Yeah. What do you guys use? Social media, email, how do you communicate to your church?
Yeah, so email would be a specific form that we've leaned into. To make a long story short, we did a lot of work over the last 2 years to overhaul communications at the Austin Stone. We were pretty reliant on basically Sunday stage-based communication. Everybody felt like, man, in order for somebody to hear, they've got to hear it from Sunday. So we basically just implemented targeted marketing, right? It's how do you actually communicate directly to audiences. Got a lot of buy-in from our staff over the course of time, help them understand the tools they can use to segment their audience and communicate specific messages to specific people. And that bought us a little more bandwidth. So email is the way we push a lot of our informing kind of communication. And social, particularly Instagram and Facebook, are places where we highlight what God is doing Monday through Saturday in the body. So kind of keeping them inspired and adding texture to what God is doing in our midst is a lot of how we use social at the Austin Stone. That being said, we do use it occasionally, to inform people as to what's currently going on. So, for instance, we did a citywide worship gathering for our students ministry on Sunday evening, and the ethos is, man, we want to inspire, we want to keep it creative. But I was getting my son ready on Sunday. We didn't know what time and where the students' gathering was going to be. So I'm like, man, we've got the ethos right. But we also got to think about just where does that information live? Right. And I couldn't find it anywhere. So good coaching moment on Sunday.
It's surprising how easy that is for something like that to happen in a church setting. I don't know exactly why that is, but communication seems like it's like one of the chief challenges of a church once you get over a couple of hundred. I mean, we've had our share of challenges on that front, and we still feel like we have lots of room for improvement there. What are you guys thinking with, well, I guess I don't actually know data on COVID spikes in Austin. I know it's kind of spiking across the country. How is it spiking here in Austin, and what are you guys thinking going forward?
Spiking is probably the wrong term for Austin. We've had a steady increase in cases that is probably correlated at least with cold weather. As the colder weather kind of is increased, people spend more time collectively indoors together, which presents opportunity for the spread of the virus. And I think that's been proven kind of throughout the Midwest and the Northwest, places where cold weather strikes earlier. Texas as a state is still, relative to the rest of the nation, slowly increasing, which I think is good. probably due to just we got warmer weather down here.
Right.
But Austin itself is, it's a steady incline. We've kind of leveled out. The key metric that we're looking at is the rolling average of hospital admissions, and that's about 32 cases per day at this point in the city of Austin.
32 cases per day of COVID-19 in particular?
For hospital admittance.
Any hospital admission?
Any hospital admission.
Oh, hospital admissions for COVID-19.
Correct, yes.
32 a day.
32 cases a day is what's being admitted into our hospital.
Much.
It's, with respect to the capacity we have in our city, we're not yet at a place where we feel like we're going to be overwhelmed. We stay pretty connected to the medical community. We have several who are involved within our congregation and able to sort of interact with them consistently. So we've got our pulse on it pretty well. And that's kind of the key thing is we don't want our hospital system to be overwhelmed by the number of cases. That's what causes a lot of the tension, a lot of the, sort of lack of capacity to care well for people and causes death ultimately. Yeah. So I think with respect to where we are is thinking about how do we serve our city in that way? How do we ensure that we're guarding capacity for healthcare to take care of those who have need? And then also, how are we navigating the freedom of conscience issue for some who desire to worship and want to be in person? Allowing for those who don't feel comfortable worshiping in person, not binding their conscience in any way, shape, or form, and providing a way for them to worship as well. So it's been a tricky thing to navigate. I feel like we've done it as well as we can. It doesn't come without conflict and tension, that's for sure.
Yeah, so. I think it's hard to avoid that with some of these issues this year. And it just surprises me that 30-some cases a day of hospital admissions for COVID-19 in a city that's about 1 million now, right?
The Metropolitan Statistical Area, the MSA, is 2.4 million, I believe, right now.
Okay.
So that'd be Austin, Round Rock, basically our kind of metro.
Gotcha. Yep. All right. So I was comparing, the numbers that I had in mind was not that recent, but it must have been more of a downtown, because at the time
the urban core is around 900,000.
Okay. That's what, and I was comparing that to Nashville at about 600,000. So when you think about 2.4 million, that would kind of cover, is that the geographical area that you're getting these 32 hospitalizations a day from?
So I think that's more from the 1 million.
Okay, but still, 1 million people, 32, I don't know. That number is just, I guess it's lower than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Which is good. I'm happy to hear that.
Austin's with respect to the rest of Texas, a fairly progressive city. And, depending on how your sort of political leanings end up, more often than not, the more progressive you are, the more restrictive you are in how people interact with COVID. And so I think that's had at least a factor to play in why we've maintained lower numbers.
Any theories on why that is?
Why Austin is a progressive city?
No. Well, I'd love to hear about that too. I do want to hear about Austin, but I have noticed that the more progressive you are, the more strict I hate to say serious because that's not the right word, but the more restrictive you are with interactions around COVID-19. Why is that?
Man, that is a really complicated question. I am by no means a political theorist nor a sociologist, so this is anecdotal observation. I think innate to human behavior is a desire for righteousness, right? There's a sense in which I want to be right. And in the sort of more progressive circles, if you want to call it that, the sense of righteousness comes from protecting and advocacy. And so I think with respect to COVID-19, it gets attached to advocating and protecting for those who are marginalized or those who are at risk. And therefore, there's a heightened sense of adding sort of, for lack of better words, law that brings about a sense of righteousness that is attached to the worldview that's often associated with a progressive person. And some of that's right and true. Like, I think there is a sense in which we love our neighbors as Christian believers, as followers of Jesus. However, this is a question of ethics that's extremely complicated. It's not merely a black and white, right and wrong kind of scenario of applying what does it look like to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. This is a way. It's not necessarily the way. What we need to do is think carefully about these issues in the context of Christian fellowship in a city like Austin or Nashville or wherever, and have dialogue around how do we be faithful in the midst of these kinds of challenges. So.
Yeah. How have you found the issue of masks to be divisive this summer, or at least potentially divisive?
I personally have not. So with respect to engagement in the people that I spend time with, I'm in a broad circle of people, both in my neighborhood and in our church fellowship. And so More often than not, it's just a simple question of what degree of comfort do you have or not. It doesn't end up polarizing. I have heard a few conversations from some of our more visible leaders at the Austin Stone that it's been a difficult issue to navigate. And I think there have been a few instances where people principally remove their masks in worship as a sign of freedom or as a sign of, I think everyone should, operate this way, which creates opportunities for contention. I think the thing I'm most proud of our leadership in our church more broadly is how well they've handled those kinds of conversations.
Okay.
It's, hey, let's dialogue through why that action was taken. Let's get to the heart of the issue rather than just assuming one's right or wrong. Again, whether you wear a mask or not, there's always a human being who has a heart. And in that heart is both righteous desire and then unrighteous sin. And we want to get to the bottom of what's driving these behaviors as we go forward.
Okay. So in Austin and at the Austin Stone, you do have always maskers and never maskers?
100%.
Okay. So, all right. So that's not just a national thing.
No.
Okay.
I think that's a national thing right now.
I am curious how masks got so political. I'm not sure that I understand it. It just has something about out of the gate. I guess it probably comes back to rights, right? That's probably what it was.
Yeah, freedom of expression.
You telling me that I need to wear a mask on my face. Yeah, that makes sense. I hate to jump around, but I did want to ask on communication. What are you using for your email? What's the kind of the method, like MailChimp or whatever? Do you use?
MailChimp is
software?
our tool of choice.
Oh, really?
So we have a church database that allows us to give a little bit more granular segmentation of our audience, and then that's automated to MailChimp, and we use that as our primary delivery mechanism so that we can basically see responses and figure out who's watching what and what do we say and figuring out how to communicate better.
Okay. Yep. All right. So Austin, the city, has had a lot of growth and change, and I'd love to know, how long have you been in Austin and what kind of changes have you seen here and what's going on kind of now?
We moved to Austin in 2004. Which, if you think about Austin and kind of its growth in national prominence, was sort of the inflection point for the city. So everybody in Texas knew about the city of Austin. People had an awareness that it was a hip and vibey and trendy kind of city, but nobody was moving here just because, man, Austin has this magnetism and gravity for tech, for governance, for education, for all the things that now it's well known for. So we came in 2004 originally to do a PhD at the University of Texas.
Oh, okay.
And moved kind of into the northern portion of what's still part of the city of Austin, but it's where kind of Austin turns into suburban life.
Like north of Georgetown yet? Or?
No, not there. No, we were actually 183 in Mopac right there, which is, again, a kind of north central part of our city.
I said Georgetown. I think I meant Round Rock.
Yes.
Were you south of Round Rock?
We were south of Round Rock. We now live in the Round Rock School District, but in the city of Austin. So we moved a little bit farther north in 2005 is when we moved up there. But Austin is a city, I think, people tell the narrative in the 70s, there was a group of individuals who were trying to retain that keep Austin weird. It's very eccentric. We don't want outsiders as part of our city. And there were some key decisions that were made that limited sort of the growth of infrastructure in the city. So traffic was terrible and always has been terrible in the city of Austin because there were decisions that were made that said we don't want to grow our city to supporting the size of, say, like a Houston or a Dallas or a San Antonio. So we got here, traffic was awful, and they were trying to catch up to some of the growth that was happening. And so we actually saw the city of Austin develop toll roads and just major infrastructure improvements, which caused it to be even worse than it was.
Because people don't want to use the toll roads?
You're doing construction in the middle of the city that's outgrowing its current infrastructure.
Yes,
So interestingly, the time we arrived was the time when it started to take off in population growth and also in infrastructure catch-up. So we have friends who've been here, they've been here their whole lives, and we have friends who moved about the same time we did. And there's a lot of people with a love for that old spirit of Austin. Keep Austin weird, shop local, engage in the arts and in community, have a sort of, down with the man kind of vibe that really does define some of the ethos of our city. But also it's coupled with the pains of growth. And so in that season, you got a lot of people who are, honestly, just really struggling with the city of Austin, going, is this the place that we're going to stay for a long period of time? So I would say that lasted until about 2015, 2016. A lot of the infrastructure development, a lot of the ways in which the city grew, the influence of the city of Austin nationally. You see it now in chains. You guys have Chewy's in Nashville. You've seen it.
Yeah, we do.
That's from
Is that an
right
Austin
here in
company?
Austin.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So,
wow.
You got all kinds of, just influence that Austin now has nationally, and brands that have been sourced here, and kind of seeing that. And so
Whole Foods too, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So its headquarters are, just right downtown.
Yep.
So in many ways, you can kind of see the sort of growth of the city, and we've matured in a way to recognize we now have national platform, national recognition. It is a city right now that people, even in the midst of COVID, are desiring to move to, so we continue to grow. The northern county of Travis County, Williamson County, is one of the fastest growing counties in the U.S. right now. The county just south of Travis County, which is Hayes County, one of the fastest growing counties in the U.S. right now. It's just exploding. But it finally feels like we've moved from being a regional city that was fighting against the attraction of people and opportunity to now being a national city who's embracing some of that identity and some of the challenges that come with it. So.
And that change has happened in the last 5 years, you'd say?
I would say, yeah, the turn for the general sentiment of the populace to say we're a national city, not just a regional city, has largely happened in this last 5 years. And I think that's just population growth. At the end of the day, so many people have moved to Austin from outside places that now that's the more predominant person you're going to interact with. It's going to be more rare you find somebody who was born and bred in Austin than somebody who moved here because
that's how Nashville is as well. Now, what do you think that's going to do to the ethos or the vibe of Austin? Is it going to just become more commercialized as it becomes a national city and so many people have been moving in and are moving in? Or is there enough of a core there that Austin is going to still be Austin going forward?
It probably depends on who you talk to. I personally think Austin will remain Austin because the ethos of our city is so strong, and because we're the state capital alongside of the University of Texas. There's still just a lot of opportunity in the institutions that are established here in our city to maintain a vibrancy and a youthfulness of thought, of innovation, of influence, of impact that attracts a certain kind of person. Mm-hmm. And I think because the culture of our city is so clear and also so cherished and valued by the urban core, it will remain as part of it. That being said, with all of the influx from so many different places, it takes a life of its own and it takes a shape of its own.
Yeah.
And so, for lack of better words, there's always true believers in any place you're a part of.
Yep.
The true believers in the city of Austin are probably really frustrated right now.
Oh, really?
We're not sincere to the root of who we were. At the same time, that's part of growth, is people adopt and adapt to their environment. So they're going to adopt, keep Austin weird, and then they're going to adapt to the fact that we now have an extraordinary number of young, upwardly mobile, highly wealthy people who are kind of that bourgeois, sort of the world is ours, and they're going to adapt the Austin ethos. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what happens in this next decade as people take and adopt the culture of Austin and then adapt to it with their kind of own narrative and story.
Yes. Okay. That's a very good way to put it. A lot of young, upwardly mobile, kind of cash flush human beings. Like there is a lot of that in Austin. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask you, you said the culture of Austin, like how would you describe the culture of Austin? And when that is one of the things that seems apparent to me. There's a lot of young, ambitious, successful, the world is ours, the sky's the limit. There's a lot of that in Austin, correct?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay. How beyond that, how would you describe the culture of Austin? And by the way, where does that come from? Is it primarily the tech scene?
I think it's equal parts job opportunity, primarily rooted in the tech sector. So national companies, international, global companies all have either outposts or their headquarters are here. So there's a drive towards that in the city of Austin that's largely, again, the sort of economics of California is driving people away from it, and Austin is the natural landing point for it. Mm-hmm. So I think job opportunity is a big piece of that. I think also the cultural vibe of Austin. So the just sort of, I would almost call it radical optimism. It's hard to find somebody in the city of Austin who's a cynic. They love our city. They love our culture. They love the art scene. They love the food. They love the impact that we have in a city. And so it is a pretty optimistic city. It's a happy city. I'd say that's part of the culture. that people are attracted to. And again, for lack of better words, the artifacts of millennial culture, the freedom of self-expression, opportunity to explore, experience economy, food, art, music, it's all here. We're sitting right in the heart of some of the gentrification of our city right now and how that's played out. And so I think there's just so much of that freely available to people.
Yes.
So in defining the culture of Austin, it might be helpful to have an embodiment of it. Matthew McConaughey is the embodiment of Austin culture.
Okay. Not Texas, Austin.
Austin, 100%.
Yeah.
He is Texan, don't get me wrong, but it's that cool, subtle, I'm extremely wealthy, but I don't live as if people would know that's the case. I have a very laid back vibe to me. Everything's cool, man. We're just, just hanging, having a good time, Why is everybody getting all frustrated all the time? I think that would be a definer of maybe in a personification Austin culture. It's just like a Matthew McConaughey, and you'll get a sense of what drives the predominant vibe of our city.
Okay, that makes total sense. That really resonates, and you mentioning a radical optimism just resonates so much. I mean, just having been through Austin a fair bit in the last several years with work, and then I was at South by one time, and then just being here, even the people we're having conversations with, like we had a tech founder yesterday, you can just pick up on that radical optimism. I think that's put really well. And then the Matthew McConaughey embodiment is also put really well. In 2009, last year, we were at the Formula One race. Have you ever been to that?
I've been to the track. I have not been to the race.
Oh man, why not?
I would like to go.
It's not happening this year. You need to go next year if it's here. Just in the last 2 years, we kind of became Formula One fans, and I got sucked into it big. And last year, we were at the Formula One race in Austin, just my wife and I, and Matthew McConaughey was there. And we're talking, Formula One is the epitome of racing. Like, there's nothing better, and there's not even a whole lot really close. And there's only 20 drivers from the best around the world. These guys are rock stars, and they're surprisingly young, and they are just like at the peak of driving. It's really 60% car and 40% airplane is really what it is. And so Matthew McConaughey was at the race, and we were across, like he was on the other side of the pits, and like just walking down the pit lane, like you would have thought like that guy was like on a different level from these drivers. You know what I mean? Like he got so much love and fanfare just walking down pit lane. I'm like, what is going on? Like, so I'm sure, there's a lot of international people at the Formula One race because it's an international sport, but there's also a lot of locals there. Yeah. And he seems to like really be a big deal here. So are you concerned? Well, how are you seeing the influx of people primarily from California? I know there's kind of this sentiment that let's not California, Texas, which I think is a fair point, right? A lot of them are moving into the Austin area from California. Have you been, hopefully you've been finding some of them or a lot of them at the Austin Stone? What kind of an impact do you think that kind of importation is going to have, and how long is that going to go on?
Well, this question is pretty personal for me. I'm not a native Texan. I grew up in Washington State. And so Eastern Washington is my heritage. It's still my home. I'll be there in a couple of weeks. I'm excited to go back and visit the land of my youth.
Eastern Washington?
Eastern Washington.
How close to Idaho?
I grew up in Spokane, Washington. So
really?
30 minutes from northern Idaho, which is where we're headed because we have a family cabin up in North Idaho. So.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've been through that area a few times.
Oh, it's
family
gorgeous.
Out there. It is gorgeous.
Just gorgeous.
Skied out there once or twice.
Where'd you ski?
I don't remember.
Schweitzer Mountain?
Yes, it was.
Okay, that's my home mountain. So I was a competitive ski racer growing up.
No way.
100%. So
really?
This is my life.
Man.
Getting to go back to
Do you think
youth.
you could keep up with me if we skied together?
I think it would be the other way around, my friend. No offense.
I wouldn't be afraid to take on that challenge, although I never did compete, so you would beat me for sure. But I love the slopes. My dad taught me that. Yeah. Skiing and snowboarding, the whole nine, yeah.
I think if you grow up in the mountains and if you grow up as a competitive racer, it's a different ballgame. I've taken a lot of different people to go enjoy the beauty that is the Pacific Northwest and specifically Schweitzer Mountain. And I have yet to find somebody who can keep up with me at the level that I'm at.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they're not there. It's just the people that I ski with in that way are from the place that I was born and did the same things I did growing up. Yeah, I'm like, I suck at football. I'm terrible at basketball. You put me on a mountain, bro, that's where I come alive.
How do you ski? If you go back to Schweitzer Mountain this winter and ski, what are you doing?
Well, I have 5 kids, and so that's changed the ball game. I'm now coach dad, on the slopes, and tour guide dad rather than, go and get myself into trouble.
Okay.
I did get to go cat skiing last year, which basically is out of bounds territory. You don't have to skin or hike. You can just go ride a cat from top to bottom. Then you get to go explore, which was so fun.
Yeah.
So
scary?
No. I mean, at this point, it takes quite a bit to get me scared. That's going to be aerials or something along those lines. Pitch doesn't bother me one bit. Snow conditions don't really bother me at all.
So you weren't doing aerials and stuff like that?
No. Yeah, this guy's a little too old for that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, you have 5 kids, so this is a different day, man. I mean, look, skiing is dangerous. Yeah, I mean, people die.
That is true. That is true. So one of my bucket list items is actually heli skiing. So that's on the list. Want to do that at some point. One of my best friends from growing up, he and I have got a plan. We'll make it happen one day, Lord willing. So yeah, I don't know how we got talking about skiing, but
you were saying it's near and dear to your heart with moving in from, because you moved in from Washington.
That's right. We were talking
Austin.
about California.
Yeah.
California's personal because Californians growing up were the great ruiners of the Pacific Northwest. So they would come up to Washington State or Idaho, buy up things, and we didn't like them very much. I've grown to enjoy my Californian brothers and sisters. They're a fun group of people. They have a similarity to Northwest culture. So when I think about it here in Austin, I'm actually glad. I am glad that there's going to be a little more West Coast influence in the city of Austin. Just, again, Austin's super laid back. I love the Texan hospitality. I do think the Californian vibe will help, especially in church culture, just some of the legacies that are challenging about traditional Southern Christianity. So I think there's some of that element that I just enjoy. I think a lot of people are frustrated by Californians moving here, but they bring wealth, they bring opportunity, they bring cultural influence and shaping. They bring Teslas, which is kind of fun, and they're coming to Tesla.
Yes.
So,
yep.
Oh man, I mean, there's 1,000 things we could talk about that cultural shaping influence of outsiders.
Yeah, but you're not concerned that so many are moving in so quickly that it's going to permanently shift or break the culture here.
It changes day to day. The things that shape the culture of our city are, again, government, education, and then those companies. So government and education are not going to be accessible to Californians at this point for a long period of time. Texans love their institutions of influence, and I sincerely doubt that shaping influence will change significantly in a short period of time.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. How soon is the Tesla plant planning to be up and running? Do you know offhand?
I don't know offhand. I know that there's a bunch of cranes out by my house.
Oh, they're building it now?
They're building, yeah.
I thought the plant was going to be south of the city.
Maybe that's the Apple complex that I'm thinking about.
Oh, okay.
I think it's Apple that's by my house, and then,
Okay.
Tesla's
is Apple
outside.
building a big office?
They
here?
are. They're
What
building a
doing?
huge facility. So
An office?
I'm not positive what it is.
Okay.
So I just know
man, why would they be building an office with everything going on? Amazon is. I mean, they're still building. Amazon, of all of the big companies, seems to be the most pro in person. There's still some real value there, which I tend to agree with. Although I think you can do virtual okay as well. But yeah, they're building in Nashville. We're getting a couple thousand jobs from Amazon.
How many people work for Amazon at this point now?
Andrew, do you remember Sam Van Hoffrigen mentioned it?
1.2 million is the total.
It's
over. Can you imagine?
Insane.
1.2 million humans that work. It's got to be unprecedented, right? I think they surpassed. What is Walmart? Do you remember? Are they bigger than Walmart? I think they surpassed. We can check that out.
I will let you know.
I mean, it's just so many people. And by the way, Andrew, when you get a second, can you turn my headphones down just a tiny bit? All right, so yeah, we'll come back. We'll see if Walmart's a bigger employer than Amazon, although I'm thinking that Amazon passed them. All right, so can we hear about, I'd like to hear about how you went from being a chemist into ministry, and then I'd like to hear about the Austin Stone.
Yeah, chemist to ministry. I think there's natural abilities that God gives people, and then there's supernatural giftings that the Holy Spirit pours out. Really from high school, I recognized I had a real strong aptitude for math and sciences. I just excelled at it. Any class I was in, any sort of standardized test that I took, I just was able to do really, really well on it. So In my high school days, that's actually when I came to Christ. I met Jesus through a ministry called Young Life, which does incarnational evangelistic ministry for high school students. I was at a Catholic high school that had Young Life present. I originally attended Young Life Camp because that was just the social thing to do at my high school. You went to Young Life Camp your sophomore year of high school. And it was the first time I had heard the gospel of Jesus presented as, creation, sin, Jesus the rescuer, repent and believe. I just had never really heard that simple message of the gospel. So to make a long story short, through some personal suffering, through watching some of my leaders in high school, I came to Christ and started participating in Christian community and in evangelism and all the things associated with leadership in God's kingdom. So I came to my senior year, educated by Catholics, came to faith through Young Life, nominally Lutheran growing up, but fairly progressive in my Western, West Coast worldview, and was just asking the question, like, what do I do with my collegiate education? And it really came down to, I knew that I was really good at academics, specifically math and sciences. I was going to be faithful to Jesus wherever I went, but I also was a golfer and a skier. So I was recruited to play Division III golf, believe it or not, which I'm terrible now. Apparently the skills go away if you don't use them.
Do you keep up? Do you still play a lot?
No, not at all.
Oh,
so
really?
5 kids means there's no time for that. Top golf, which is like, that's fun. It's like bowling, but the golf version.
Yeah.
That's a fun one to do. But all that to say, I went into my university kind of experience looking for education, and then how could I entertain my 2 passions, golf and skiing. It came down to the University of Notre Dame, which golf and skiing is not really an option. If you're in the Midwest, it's pretty cold and it's very flat, so skiing's out the window. Golf, you can play, if you're on a university schedule, maybe like 2 weeks out of the year when the weather's like that. Yeah. So, and I was not good enough to play at Notre Dame. So that was an option. And the reason I thought about Notre Dame was they were top 10 chemical engineering at that point. So I knew that I wanted to utilize the skills that I had to make as much money as I could, and chemical engineering was the best way I could figure to do that. The second was actually go to school at Pomona College in California, which was D3 golf. I was going to get to surf, ski, play golf, have a good education, and enjoy my collegiate life. Faith didn't really play a huge part in determining which school I went to, but it was an element. I was thinking, how can I thrive in Jesus too? So chose Notre Dame, chemical engineering. That's what I wanted to do. Did all the freshman year stuff, found a fellowship, started growing my faith, hit my first chemical engineering class, which is mass transport, which is the most boring thing in the world.
Chemical engineering?
Yeah.
Mass transport?
How does stuff move through pipes? It would be the summary of that class.
Huh.
I was like, this is the most boring thing that I could possibly think of doing with my life.
Yeah.
I do not care one iota about this, but you know what I really love? I love how chemicals interact with one another. I love the fundamental aspect of the science because I'm by nature a problem solver. There's not elegant solutions in chemical engineering. There's brute force and there's good design. Those are great things. That's just not how I'm wired. I want to have a very simple, elegant solution to a problem. So that led me down the path of chemistry, and particularly physical chemistry. I very much wanted to understand theoretically and practically how different things interacted to make new compounds. So, and if you're asking the question, yes, I'm the biggest nerd you've ever met in your life, 100%.
But you don't come across as a nerd.
I am 100%.
When you say nerd, I think that's a cover for smart, right? Let's just be honest on that.
Fair enough. But I do care a lot about very niche topics. So
sure, yeah.
But
you have that ability to kind of zero in on a subset of information and dissect it. Look at why it is that way, what could be different about it, how you could use those things to put together maybe a little bit differently to get a better result. Like, is that...
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's still to this day.
That's
in
a gift.
Ministry, one of the things that serves me well is being able to identify a problem, assess resources, begin to think about possible solutions, and then chart a course towards how do we solve this problem.
Yes, and I'll just pause you for just a second because I want you to keep going. But did that manifest itself when you were a child as... How did that manifest itself? Were you sometimes a difficult child because of those traits?
No? You're getting deep. I like it. So I am a middle child of 3 children. My dad passed away when I was in second grade. And so those I was 7 years old.
Oh, wow. I was 10 when my dad died. Yeah, from cancer. What did your dad die from?
Cancer, stomach cancer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's a moment, as you know, that just marks you.
Mm-hmm.
It changes you and it shapes you. And as a middle child, my older brother really struggled. He was old enough, I think, to understand the implications that a loss of a father would have. My sister was pretty young and still, I think she was 5 at that point. And so there wasn't a lot of like handles on what the impact was. And I was kind of right in between. And both my brother and sister each had their own unique challenges. And so as a middle child, oftentimes you're trying to stand out, right? You're trying to find a sense of identity by defining what you're not. You do that either through rebellion, oftentimes. So you're going to be the black sheep of the family, or you do it through the route that I chose, which is performance. I'm going to excel in any area that I can. And so my way of kind of finding a sense of identity was the pursuit of excellence.
I see.
And that was pretty much, what drove me early on in childhood was how do I be the very best at anything that I'm doing?
Yeah. And as far as you can't, I wouldn't ask you to speak for your brother, but how did he react?
I think there was, a sense of grief and loss. Then there was a little bit of, kind of acting out. My mom remarried in about 18 months following. And so I think there was the struggle to, kind of recognize the loss of his biological father and then attach to, an imposed father figure. My stepdad, he was phenomenal. Like he did such a great job of integrating into our family. And to this day, I'm blessed that he is my stepdad. But still, that creates tension for an oldest who's protective, who's, fiercely driven to care well for his family. To introduce another father figure into the mix is challenging.
Yeah. Okay. Yep.
So,
yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Because I too can like get really focused on some minutia details, and then I was a very difficult kid. I was a hard kid to raise before my dad died, and somewhat difficult thereafter. Although I feel like that made me grow up and mature a little bit.
Yeah.
So, okay, thanks for humoring me on that. Let's go back to college where you were at.
Yeah. So, pursuing chemical engineering, realized I really like the chemistry aspect of things. Kind of simultaneous to that, the college environment I was in didn't have a lot of structured ministry. And I think you've gotten to know me well enough to know that I'm the kind of guy when there's a vacuum of leadership, I'm going to step in and fill it, And so whatever the leadership opportunity is, I'm looking for it, I'm going to find it, and I'm going to lead in the midst of it. So I started to lead in ministry. I kept leading in Young Life. I was pretty ambitious, always wanted to be the one who was, out in front, leading people, making sure they were effective and powerful in what they were doing in ministry and in life as well. So I started to see some growth and success, for lack of better words, and affirmation of gifts that I believe God had given me in leadership, in ministry. So I'm successful in my chemistry career and also being fairly successful as you can, in a college-based ministry environment in leadership. So I had kind of a crisis of decision as I got to the end of my university education. Do I want to seemingly pursue my abilities in chemistry, which I was very, very, very good at chemistry. And also I have this opportunity to explore latent gifts of leadership in ministry that were being expressed and affirmed in a variety of different places. So I went into just a season of prayer. I was asking the Lord, what do you want from me? And I'd applied to a few grad schools and also was considering, a staff role in ministry with Young Life. And I was praying one night in my bed, and I just said, Lord, what do you want from me? And in the few times that I've heard God's voice, he said, go to Texas. So Texas was...
What year of school were you in at this point?
This was my senior year of college. So,
wow.
It was like unique experience.
Yeah, and just on that, so you must have been fairly mature in your faith to be kind of positioning chemistry versus ministry leadership, because I have to imagine at where you're at that point, the compensation and the rewards and so were so much greater on the physical side than ministry leadership, correct?
Yeah.
And yet you were willing to at least entertain a ministry leadership path at what would be perceived at the time as like great personal expense, probably, right?
Yeah.
And so you had a mature enough faith to realize that if God wanted you in spiritual leadership, that would still be worth it. and that would be the better path forward if you were clear that that's what God wanted you to do, even at the expense of, making a lot of money or having maybe a really good, bright future with tons of upside on the chemistry front.
Yeah. That certainly factored into my decision making. I think, again, thinking back, why did I choose Notre Dame? It was opportunity for, material advancement in the skills that I had. That didn't change a ton. I think as I grew in Christ in my collegiate years, it certainly added a dimension to how I thought about decisions I was making. But I would say probably more for me than anything was what I enjoyed doing most. I recognized I was really good at chemistry, and I really did enjoy it. And I was also really capable and gifted for the task of leadership and ministry, and I really enjoyed that a lot as well. And so for me, it was more of the conflict of what do I enjoy most that I was bringing to the Lord, even though there was opportunity in both, and cost, especially with vocational ministry. But the Lord said, go to Texas. Texas was a tier 2 school at that point. I had one professor that I wanted to work for here at the University of Texas. It was definitely not the top of my list, but I chose to be faithfully obedient to what I believe God told me to do in going to Texas. And now kind of retrospectively, you have hindsight in why God would direct those particular steps. But we came here, with a view towards chemistry. I was like, all right, Lord, this is your will. You said go to Texas. The door is PhD. I'm going to go whole hog in PhD.
Are you married at this time?
I am, yes.
Okay.
My wife and I got married in 2004.
Okay.
So then we got married in May and then moved in August here to Texas.
Okay.
So man, I dove in. I basically finished all of my coursework in a year and a half, which usually takes about 3 years for most PhD students. I passed my qualifying exams at a year and a half, which usually happens at year 3. And then I had just gotten a $500,000 grant funded for the fundamental research I was going to be doing, which if you want to nerd out just for a second, the basics of what I was doing was the catalytic abatement of nervous agents. So basically, sarin gas or VX, I was trying to figure out how can I make a mask for battlefield soldiers that would catalytically decompose those gases and keep them safe.
Whoa.
It was a lot of fun.
That was going to be the $500,000 grant project?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was fundamental science associated with that kind of application.
Does that exist today?
I do not know.
Okay.
Probably not at this point because we were very well out. So again, scaling up what we were doing would take a lot of time and a lot of work. But the idea was making a cheap catalyst. How do we create a cheap disposable catalyst out of the materials that we have in a specific way that would decompose these agents quickly and effectively? So again, humongous nerd. Is me. But I threw myself into that work, and also we got connected to the Austin Stone at that point. We were looking for a church home. To make a very long story short, we had some really difficult experiences in churches. We came here to Austin with a little bit of a limp and an aversion to large churches. In God's kindness, over the course of looking for a variety of community of fellowships that we could dig into and participate in, he just basically didn't provide an open door for my wife and I to find a community we connected with. We read an article on Chris Tomlin in the Austin American-Statesman. We didn't know who he was at that point. And we also I had a friend who was TAing with me who just invited us, said, why don't you come check out the Austin Stone? So in November of 2004, we chose to worship at the Austin Stone for our first Sunday, and then we joined a small group and got really deeply connected and stepped in to give ourselves to the life of the church as well. So
married in May, moved in August, and attended the Stone in November.
Correct. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, very quickly actually.
Yeah.
I mean, you weren't here very long before you started attending the Austin Stone.
I mean, I think you'll catch a pattern for me as I'm a pretty decisive guy with a high degree of urgency. I'm like, let's not waste any time. Let's knock this bad boy out. So
I can appreciate that for sure. Yeah.
We dove in. And so, kind of worked through all my PhD stuff. And at the same time, I helped start our college ministry at the Stone at that point. We didn't have, in a sense, a super strong leadership core for a wide group of students that we had attending on Sundays. So myself and two friends, Logan Gentry and Travis Wuso,
started the college ministry?
We did, yeah.
And by the way, sorry to interject, but how old is the Austin Stone at this point?
So they started in December of 2002. So kind of when we stepped into leadership in college ministry, gosh, that would have been 2006. So like August of 06. So about 4 years had
So
transpired.
young church.
Yeah, very, very young, which has its strengths and its weaknesses. So in the midst of all my PhD work, I was also just, hey, let's lead this thing out. Let's figure out a way to minister to these, 1,000+ college students who are showing up on Sundays at that point, and was kind of doing double duty. And I think through that experience, I talked about the things that I enjoyed doing. I continued to have success in chemistry, but my joy was diminishing pretty quickly. I didn't love being in the lab all day, every day. I didn't love the environment that I was in because I think fundamental research attracts a specific kind of person. I like the concept of fundamental research. I don't like the actual day in, day out work of having to do fundamental research.
What's fundamental research?
So basically, you're in a lab all day long trying to figure out basic fundamental questions, right?
I see.
So how does molecule A interact with molecule B at specific temperature under, laser stimulation? Like, that's intriguing question. The work to solve the problem is not what got me lit up. Yeah. I love people. I love them. And being in an environment where you're with the same 4 people asking the same question day in, day out was really difficult for me. So I just started to lose a little bit of the joy of it, even though there was opportunity and I knew kind of, hey, this is what I'm going to do if I end up getting my PhD. Just joy diminished, but I was thriving and loving every minute of what I was getting to do in college ministry. It was seeing lives transformed. It was seeing ministry be built. It was seeing leaders be trained and sent out, and I came alive when I was doing that. And so our lead pastor at that point had this harebrained idea. What if we trained pastors in the context of the local church rather than sending people to seminary to be trained? So I kind of became the guinea pig for what now is the Institute, which is part of what I lead, to train pastors in the context of a local church in doctrine and in practice. How do we actually teach people God's word faithfully and with great depth, while at the same time saying this has to land in the lives of everyday saints, everyday people, everyday mission, and we're going to do that together. So,
who was the lead pastor?
His
at that
name
point?
is Kevin Peck. So yes, he's a dear friend.
Oh, at that point,
yeah. So
so way back then.
Yeah, I should have used his name at the first part.
Okay,
yes, Kevin.
What year is this though?
That was 2007. So
so Kevin Peck was the lead pastor back then.
Mm-hmm.
I see. Okay, he wasn't the founding pastor though, right?
No, Matt Carter's our founding pastor.
Okay, got it.
Yep. Okay, so yeah, that's in a sense, kind of what happened was joy diminished in chemistry, and joy increased in ministry, and then opportunity arose. And my parents thought I was insane. Like, what do you mean you're going to leave your PhD early and just get a master's degree and step into an uncertain role in church ministry? That sounds nuts.
Yeah.
It was a leap of faith as well because we had our first son, Micah, in March of 2007. We were kind of wrestling with the decision. I made the decision in May of 2007. I wrote my master's thesis in June and July, and then matriculated in August and started at the Stone in August to become our first resident for college ministry and various other things that needed to be done at that point. So man, I took a hard right turn into ministry from chemistry. I think as I look back on that experience, there are 3 primary things that really the Lord used in my PhD to prepare me well for ministry. The first is fundamental science. You're asking frontier of knowledge kinds of questions. Nobody's answered this question before. There's not a pathway to know how to solve this problem. There are tools and there are questions. That's it. And in ministry, in so many ways, every person I come across is a frontier of knowledge. They're a new person with a new story, with new sin, with new trauma, with new opportunity, and it's so fun to explore. In a sense, it's this unlimited frontier of knowledge in ministry that I love getting to explore with people. I think the second is most graduate labs are resource-limited environments. You don't have a lot of cash. There's a term we call a kludge. It's a temporary solution that becomes a permanent one over time because you just had to use duct tape and baling wire, or in our case, a lot of tin foil and high voltage electricity to figure out how to make this machine work. So in a sense, you're always resource limited in ministry, as you're aware of.
Mm-hmm.
People rarely have enough dollars to do the things that they desire to do, and rarely have enough people or leaders or whatever it is to do the thing you want to accomplish. So I learned how to thrive in a resource-limited environment in my PhD education. And then third and finally is you're not directed. I don't think it's a mystery that most PhD advisors are pretty horrible managers. They're academics, they're intellectuals. They're not in the business of people. And so they're not there day in, day out teaching you how to do the things you need to thrive. They're basically throwing you in the deep end and say, figure it out.
Yep.
And so I think I learned how to thrive in a non-directed, self-motivated kind of way, which again, I think translates very well to particularly pioneering forms of ministry, where you're figuring out how to do these things and nobody's telling you, you need to go do this thing.
Yeah.
You just got to go figure out how to do it. So
Isn't that striking how the Lord gave you gifts in gave you a certain set of gifts and talents, and then refined and built up and strengthened those gifts and talents through chemistry, and then turned you loose on ministry? I mean, it's so clear. Like when you're telling your story, it's so clear what the Lord had in mind, you know? And I also find it, I find it uncommon, although you would know, so I'm curious what you think about this, but it would seem to me like most chemists maybe aren't the most people persons, right? Is that a fair...
You could say that more strongly if you wanted to.
Oh, really? Okay.
100%.
That was kind of my perception. But here you are, a chemist who is a people person. So, and then the Lord kind of directs you. That's what a testimony to the Lord's ability to kind of, I'm thinking of Psalm 139:5, like hemming you in before, behind, his right hand is upon you, just moving you through the field of chemistry into where you are now in this ministry, and how that prepared you for and equipped you for what you're doing now.
Yep. Amen.
It's really something.
It's been a journey, man. It's definitely not what I expected life would look like. So maybe to, put it in narrative form, I was a, West Coast, educated by Catholics, non-church centric disciple of Jesus. Like I was highly evangelistic. I didn't want much to do with the church. And now I'm a Reformed Southern Baptist megachurch executive pastor in Texas. I'm like, how did this happen?
I didn't know the Austin Stone was Southern Baptist.
We are. We don't fly the flag super high.
Okay.
We're Baptistic in our heritage. I often say we're Baptist with a little b, not a big B. We're culturally not Baptist, but we are theologically Baptist.
Okay, sure. That makes sense. What did Kevin make of you at the time? How was that relationship?
Oh, man, Kevin and I are dear friends. Kevin's first nickname for me, he'll tell the story, was Chip, because I was a pretty arrogant, also pretty direct, and fairly intense person. So he called me Chip because I had a chip on my shoulder.
Okay.
So I think one of the things that I love about Kevin is his ability to identify potential in people, to see what God sees in them, and then to be willing and patiently draw that out over time. So Kevin modeled for me in that moment, and still does to this day, just patient presence with the raw material of spiritual leadership, and doing the thing that we should be able to do, molding character and shaping doctrine. Kevin did those two things for me in ways that I will be eternally grateful for. So, man, I think that was the early, relationship for us. Then we became colleagues. I stepped onto the staff, and that
How old were you at that point?
I was 27 at that point. And so I learned a lot in watching how Kevin led. And 2011, I stepped into a formal executive pastor role, where he was fully lead pastor at that point. We had our pastor of preaching and a few other senior leaders in our organization. And I think, again, when you have deep personal relationship that's bent from discipleship, that then becomes collegial relationship, so we're in ministry and employment together, And then now we're growing together. There's opportunity for conflict and tension like any relationship. So Kevin and I have been such good friends and had so much relationship over time in ministry that we have not been, free from conflict and tension. And I think we're aware of that and learn how to lead alongside one another really, really well because we're committed to having authentic, complex relationship. Authentic in that we want to be fully known and fully transparent, which means we have to be comfortable with the fact that we hurt each other. And complex because, again, we have a lot of history. We're dear friends. We have a stewardship of this church as elders together. He's still my boss to this day, which means I have a subordinated relationship to him. And we each have different gifts, and so we're different, even though we have similarities with one another. And we've learned to navigate, I think, over time, how to do conflict well. But we're more like a married couple at this point than we are just colleagues in ministry.
Yeah. Is it kind of you two at the inner circle, or is there a couple others in there?
No, I think we have a really strong plurality. I think at the Austin Stone, one of the unique things that Matt Carter, our founding pastor, brought, in addition to the person of Jesus being the hero of our church, like that's not just lip service, that's genuinely true. I think Matt in particular had the opportunity to think like celebrity culture, but chose in humility and fought against it very deeply in his own soul to say, no, Jesus will be the supreme hero of the Austin Stone, and that's going to be evidenced in our plurality. That means in the pulpit, that means in ministry, that means in team leadership, that means in everything we are going to humbly submit ourselves to one another, though imperfectly. We've had plenty of conflict, plenty of tension. Matt laid that foundation. And I think we've continued to build on that foundation. Kevin has deeply valued and modeled plurality, humility, and submission. Again, it's not easy. It is very difficult. It is not perfect. But he does that really well, and that's become a hallmark, I think, of our leadership. So when push comes to shove, we have, I think it's currently 11 people who would be in our like senior leadership room, each with different gifts, each with different contributions. But again, 11 people is a lot.
It is a lot.
To have in a decision-making room. And again, it's not without its challenges, but it is a pretty healthy decision-making room that really does value a plurality, a myriad of different kinds of voices, and can do it decently well, I think, together.
So that Jesus-focused plurality, non-celebrity leadership culture that you just talked about, it's fascinating to me that you actually brought this up, because this is something that I wanted to ask you about very specifically. Last night I was over at friends Adam and Colleen Reitelbach, who were in Nashville and moved back to Austin about a year ago, and I think Colleen has attended the Stone in the past. They're not going there now, but recently they just popped in for some reason. There was something, I think their church went online at last minute or something. I forget what it was. But so we're talking about this week and who's going to be on the podcast and stuff. And she said that it seems like the leadership of the Austin Stone has been deliberate or strategic about this non-celebrity. She couldn't actually name the lead pastor, which surprised me because she lives right here and she's attended before. But I picked up on that too when I was kind of researching you, and then Kevin Peck, I think is tomorrow potentially. Yeah, pretty sure it's tomorrow. That what you just described is apparent to me as an outsider who has just been browsing around on the internets, basically getting some information. So that's a deliberate move. That's a strategic move on behalf of the Austin Stone's leadership. And it started from Matt Carter, and it was kind of carried along by Kevin Peck.
Yeah, that's definitely the summary view of exactly how it unfolded.
And is that primarily so that Jesus can be the center point of this church and this ministry? I assume that's the ultimate, right? But is there a secondary motive there so that if we all make mistakes, right? If a lead pastor or if someone in leadership happens to make a mistake, the whole church doesn't crumble just around that?
I mean,
is it that practical?
That's maybe preventative and risk management thinking. I would say probably it is more rooted in human flourishing. The recognition that God has created us in his image, but he has limited us. He's given each one of us a limited number of days, limited number of hours, limited amount of emotional capacity, distinctive giftings. and recognizing that no one person can fulfill the ministry of Jesus. We follow Jesus, but the Holy Spirit pours out different gifts. I was just having a conversation with one of our pastors last evening, and he was just critiqued by some people in our church, and he receives it with humility, and he says, I'm so sorry, I desire to be better. But he's also recognizing I'm a human. Mm-hmm. I can't be everything that you desire for me to be, and if I'm a slave to your expectations, I become the sacrificial lamb. Mm-hmm. I'm the one who, in a sense, dies. And that's in part Christ-like. It's how we're supposed to be as shepherds of God's flock. We willingly and voluntarily would give our lives for the sake of God's glory and for the sheep. But it is to say, we also value the fact that we're humans. And for us to flourish as shepherds who give sacrificially and generously to the body means we recognize our limitation in our humanity, mm-hmm. and we're going to lead out of our humanity. We grew very fast as the Austin Stone. And we had a season, I would say, of youthful hubris that said we can do anything. Mm. There is that real sense where, there were some years where we were so convinced that literally anything we put our minds to, we could do. And each of us in some way, shape, or form reaped what we sowed. I think a lot about Galatians chapter 6, verse 8, and this idea of reaping what you sow. Those who sow in the flesh will reap in the flesh. Those who sow in the Spirit will reap in the Spirit. And mm-hmm. our humanity means that we can sow and we can reap, and we're going to sow in the Spirit to the best of our possible ability. But sowing in the Spirit means embracing the fact. Mm-hmm. I can't be everywhere at all times. I cannot be Superman, mm-hmm. And it requires a team of people who are called according to God's purposes with shared ownership, but complementary leadership and gifting to really thrive and to serve a body like ours and to see the things we desired to happen actually come true. Mm-hmm. So, man, I think those are just some random thoughts. I guess I'm rambling now.
No, it's helpful. Is the leadership team clear enough on this idea of plurality, non-celebrity culture, Jesus focus? Is everyone clear on that enough together that if someone starts to step outside of that into sort of a celebrity, look at me just a little bit, it's never, of course, that clear and no one says those exact words, but if you start to pick up on one of the 11 or other core pastors and leaders, are you all clear enough on what you're after there that someone goes and grabs him by the shirt a little bit and gives him a tug?
Yeah, I think, the way we've talked about it in a cultural value is we want to celebrate publicly but correct privately. And mm-hmm. so I think there is an intentional pursuit of one another to really ask genuine questions, to assume the best, but also to be sincere in the questions that we ask. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I mentioned my conversation yesterday, and then last week I was having a conversation with another one of our leaders, just how are you doing in 2020? What do you think God has taught you, and what are the wounds that you're carrying? Mm. And those kinds of questions perhaps need to grow in frequency within our leadership team, but they're not abnormal to the way that we interact with one another. And so I think in many ways, when we think about celebrity culture, there's that sense of wanting to have preventative measures that say this can't happen, which are good and they're helpful. What we have tried to do is be embodied humans mm-hmm. who recognize our limitation, who ask sincere questions, who try to presume that God's grace is operative in the other person and presume that sin is operative in us, but are pretty fearless in our willingness to ask hard questions of each other, and mm-hmm. then courageous to respond and say, this is how I'm actually doing, not how I'm, sort of putting on a mask that I need to perform for you in this moment.
And is that the courage to ask hard questions and the fearlessness to respond, is that born out of Kevin Peck's leadership style and kind of his development of leaders? And has he been deliberate on that front? Is that from you? Is that just something that's a gift from the Lord that just sort of landed upon you guys? Where does that come from?
That's a hard question to answer. I think we have been pretty vigorous about pursuing holiness and also pretty vigorous about allowing people to be individual people. We've kind of vacillated from maybe one direction to the other. It's like we sort of have that, legacy of hyper-spirituality of like wanting to call one another out in sin and make sure that you're walking faithfully with Jesus and do these things. And also a desire for individual people to be themselves and to be okay with not being okay. And I think that was maybe a part of the beginnings of what became a culture that started to ask some of those questions. I think Kevin has done a very good job of being vulnerable and also of inviting that kind of conversation with a position of power and authority. I think there are others of us on our team who have seen that and tried to build from that to have a healthy, plural, consistent culture. And we just have different gifts. I believe I'm a gifted shepherd. God has spiritually gifted me to equip the saints in that way. And therefore, there's a pastoral disposition and a disarming way in which I can ask really hard questions of people. And I do think that's contributed to a culture that is growing in its effectiveness over time at the Austin Stone in our leadership. And I think there are others who've been just courageous. I think about my friend Tyler David. Tyler asks some really hard questions in some really awkward moments that other people wouldn't ask, and I'm
like
so grateful he does that. Yes, right? He asks the hard question. He's the guy who's like, that's my job. I'm going to do that,
That's not an easy job.
No, it's not. And so I think, it's a contribution of multiple different people that are creating that, really honest, courageous, yet sincere sort of opportunity.
How many pastors are there at the Stone? Do they all report to you, or do they report to Kevin or someone else?
Our reporting structures change. We do have kind of two organizational structures, for lack of better words. We have our church, our ecclesial structure, which our congregation pastors are the lead elders of elder teams within our congregations. So it's their stewardship to ensure their spiritual vitality, that they're shepherding the flock of God that's entrusted to their care in that particular congregation. So they're...
Okay, this is like campus pastors?
Yep. So, they're senior leaders in our organization in the ecclesial sense, right?
Okay, and how many campuses?
We have 6 right now. So their job is spiritual leadership and spiritual oversight. And then we also have an organization. So how we think about our 501c3 and our staffing, and that's really kind of it's our organization. And Kevin's our lead pastor, and so everybody reports up to Kevin in terms of the employment function and the leadership functions for how are we going to get to where we desire to be. So those two things overlay, which means we have very complex relationships with each other.
Yeah.
And that's where we wade in really clearly to the best of our ability, but also it's muddy water and it's muddy territory. I get teased a lot that I put on multiple hats. I'm like, I'm going to wear my elder hat in this conversation right now. Or I'm putting on my boss hat. You need to sit down and listen for a second. Or I'm putting on my friend hat. We're going to just talk as friends. Or my team jokingly says, I put on my ass hat. So
you have one of those too? Do the 6 campus pastors, are they part of the 11 core leadership team that you referenced earlier?
Yes. Yeah. So it'd be our executive pastors, our congregation pastors, our pastor of theology, pastor of worship, lead pastor. I think that's it. I'm probably missing somebody right now. And
what's sort of the culture among the pastors? And maybe it just varies, but is it kind of heavy on the kind of the theologian side, which I don't suspect, that's not what I'm picking up on, or is it like what's sort of there tends to be a kind of a spectrum on pastors, like some are like really strong theologians and scholars and just awful at admin, and they admit that, and then others are pretty good organizationally and with administration and aren't quite as theologically or scholarly robust. You know what I mean? What's sort of the spectrum that you guys have?
I think we have a really good balance. Myself, Dave Barrett, James Paquette are executive pastors. We lead the large departments of the Austin Stone. And we would be, leadership oriented, each with different gifts in that area, but certainly administrative, more management oriented, resource allocation, thinking a lot of those kinds of things. We do it through the lens of God's word and through the gospel of grace, but that's what we steward is resources and personnel. Our congregation pastors would be preachers and shepherds. They would largely be people who love God's word, want to announce and herald God's word to God's people, and then they want to care for the flock, generally speaking. Each one is different. Again, different people, different giftings, different styles of leadership, but I would say if I'm going to paint with a broad brush, that would be it. Aaron Ivey, our pastor of worship, is just insanely creative. His vision for the beauty of God is... it's a thing to behold, and how that's expressed in music, in art, in food, and even more than that, in people. Aaron sees the beauty in every individual human soul, unlike many people that I've been around, and I love him for that. I love it. I think about Halim, who our pastor of teaching and theology, loves God's word, loves doctrine. And so he's going to spend the majority of his time in study and in thought and preparation for preaching and in oversight of our pulpit. So Kevin, you're going to get to, I don't know if you've met him, but
I haven't.
Man, that dude is so insanely catalytic. He's got 10 ideas before breakfast that we should all be doing right now. We just don't have the time, ability, or resources to do them. And so,
is he mature enough though not to do you get to say no? Because some leaders have those ideas and no one can say no, then everything's a mess.
Yeah, I think that's part of Kevin's and my unique relationship is we see, again, shared ownership but complementary leadership. So Kevin probably trusts me uniquely relative to many other people because of our history, and therefore is much more willing to receive no's from me than perhaps maybe a majority of other people. Primarily because I've demonstrated I think on the same wavelength, I have the same pace, I'm attentive to the Spirit's leadership, but with very complementary gift set. I'm just like, man, I love this idea. Not the right time.
Yeah, okay.
Not the right time.
Yep.
It's the right idea. All of the things that we do, in a sense, were in some way generated in Kevin's mind and his heart. So the Austin Stone Institute, Kevin's idea. I love that we're doing this. The way in which we get from here to there, that's usually where I'm going to play a significant role. So Kevin, love the idea. Can you give me 5 years?
Oh man, that's the worst news from a visionary too. But it's true though. Ray Ortlund, our founding pastor at Emmanuel Nashville, has said 1 step ahead as a leader, 2 steps ahead as a visionary, and 3 steps ahead as a martyr.
Yeah, it's good.
There's such a thing as being too far out front.
That's right.
How deliberate are you guys on the diversity front with pastors and staff and music leaders and band members and that type of thing?
I think with respect to diversity, we have taken some strides. We started a journey prayerfully in 2014 out of conversations with saints of God at the Austin Stone. We are largely a homogenous, white, dominant culture as a church. And in 2014, started some work, and honestly, we're responding to tensions in the body from a variety of non-white individuals who were attending and saying, hey, what does it look like for you to progress in this area? Or, I love the preaching. I'm going to be honest, the worship is terrible. And that's cultural. That's not necessarily, Aaron and his team do a phenomenal job of leading worship. It is a cultural form of worship. And so it's fine for people to disagree with the fact that they don't love the way that we pursue congregational worship on Sundays. So 2014, 2015, 2016 were kind of things bubbling up. In 2017, we collectively as elders said, one of our strategic priorities, matters of emphasis, things that we are going to do is deeply invest in progress towards a more diverse leadership team. So you can do that in a lot of different ways. We chose by thinking through how do we advance leadership, and so that was particularly staffing first. We wanted to pursue a more diverse staff body, and are still growing in that, but have taken leaps and bounds in terms of how we can think about both the quality and the diversity of the candidates we're bringing on as part of our staff team. That's codified in our HR processes, which I can talk about later, but I don't think anybody really cares about how we do that. But needless to say, we have...
How we do what? I'm sorry?
Pursue diverse candidates.
Oh, okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the second was then thinking about representation, right? How do we have a body that represents our church and our city more faithfully without diminishing what we believe God's mandate is for elders and deacons specifically in the church? And we have a program we call our development program. That's kind of the baseline for how we train people in doctrine and disciplines, spiritual disciplines, to become leaders in the church. And so we started pursuing in 2018 and 2019 a recruitment to that program with an eye towards greater diversity in the body. I would say 2020 has accelerated a lot of this conversation for us. When culture starts driving the narrative, you have an opportunity to respond as the church. We always want to try and tell a better, more faithful story than what the culture tells us, right? There certainly are injustices that exist in our nation. There are injustices in the city of Austin that have existed and perpetuated for years and decades and almost a century at this point. And then there's questions about how do we as a local fellowship engage in those kinds of conversations? How do we form our body So they're not being driven by the news cycle or by the occasions or terminology. That's a question we're wrestling with right now. And how do we as a local institution in the city of Austin be a part of reconciliation and justice in ways that are meaningful and long-lasting? And that introduces a concept of cultural engagement, as well as thinking about what's the role of the church in institution building and society shaping. And so I think that's a lot of the conversation we're having.
Such big questions.
They're
huge questions.
You know?
I mean,
and the average person in the church, I don't mean to, but they're just not asking those questions right now. But if you want long lasting change, if you want sincere biblical justice, it means we have to ask those fundamental questions about God's purposes for diversity in the local fellowship and how that plays out, and God's role for the church in shaping culture and being an institution in society.
Yes.
You're not going to have unity. You're not going to have change if you don't have those questions answered to a degree.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, it does seem to be like the things that get most attention is like having diversity among the pastors and the leadership. And then what gets said in services, kind of nodding towards or speaking directly to some of these issues. What doesn't get talked about nearly as much is the role of the institution, the role of the church in its context, working for justice, almost kind of behind the scenes, so to speak.
Yeah.
Are you guys, how do you guys think about that aspect in particular? Or what are you doing there, if anything?
You know, I think in response to George Floyd's killing and Ahmaud Arbery's killing this summer, with the cultural moment, what that did was bring an awareness of the diversity of opinions we have, even in our senior leadership team, around how we as a church engage in culture. How do we think about economics? Should we have diversity? Should we have singularity? How do we think about issues of justice or reparations? Should we have diversity or singularity? How do we think more broadly about Christian ethics and what we're supposed to do in calling our people to respond in this moment? Should we bind conscience? Should we not? Should we preach on it? Should we not? I mean, there's so many questions associated with that cultural moment, and what it revealed was the work that needs to be done. So oftentimes when I talk about this, I say there's I and then there's we. I have a very finely developed understanding of what I think the role of church is and how we play a part in these kinds of issues, largely speaking because my doctoral work was focused on the local church. It's the doctrinal area of, for lack of better words, expertise that I have. I'm Dr. Todd Engstrom, and it's in church. That's what I think about. That's what I lead. That's what I want to do. But I think also it's a recognition that other people have different giftings and also different areas of interest in doctrine, and that's been revealed even in our team at this point. So how do we answer that question? I have a very strong understanding of what I believe. We don't have a collective answer yet, and that's part of the work that we need to do as we go forward.
Okay. Can we hear your thoughts, your opinion?
Yeah, perhaps it's summarized in this way, without getting too academic. I believe the church has two primary roles. And the first is the form of a multiplying church so the gospel can get to as many people as it can in this generation. That's a key thing. And so we want to be unashamedly, apologetically evangelistic in our disposition. We want to be multiplying, reproducing disciples of Jesus who reproduce new churches culturally and cross-culturally. That's the thing that I spend so much time of my leadership energy in, is saying, I want the church to multiply. And at the same time, the church is an institution. And the church as an institution has two roles. One is, how do we be faithfully witnessing the good news of Jesus and the realities of God's kingdom here and now in this present age? And how do we steward the gospel of grace for the next generation if the Lord tarries? Like, those are the two questions I think that really reside in the church's institution. What do we do in the city of Austin as an institution here? And then how do we herald the gospel, yes, but translate the gospel to the next generation? So Lord willing, if my children repent and believe, they'll have a foundation to stand on of what it means to believe the gospel in their cultural moment, in their cultural time. I think that's a part of institutional church as well.
Yeah. And are those things that are being kind of taught, or is that groundwork being laid in the institution?
So the Austin Stone Institute would be an artifact of some of the things that I believe. So, right? So For the Nations, the ministry that I lead that supports 142 international cross-cultural disciple makers, church planters, is one expression of that. I want us to fulfill God's global mandate, as it's laid out in Matthew chapter 28, it is unashamedly clear that we are called by God to make disciples of all nations. Mm-hmm. I have a hard time with churches who have no view towards the task remaining because it's so crystal clear. I know that you're supposed to make disciples in your backyard. I know it. You're also supposed to be thinking about the nations. What is your role in God's global mandate to be worshiped amongst every tribe, tongue, and nation? What is your role to see the knowledge of the glory of the Lord cover the earth as the waters cover the sea? What is your role as a local fellowship to say, there are people right now who are in desperate need of this gospel message? What's your role to go, to send, to support, to pray, play a part in engaging the nations? You've got to be a part of that. And then there's ways in which we do that. Rapidly expanding movements of the gospel is something we think about a lot. So I would say that's part of it. I believe that mercy and justice is a part of the heart of God. I believe that God cares about racial justice in the city of Austin. I believe that he has a deep and abiding passion for the city of Austin to flourish in the fullness of what he purposed for it in this present age. And I believe that God can save cities overnight. He did it. In Nineveh, he did it, and he can do it, and we want to see it happen. And so we're going to labor in our own city for justice and mercy, and that's not at odds with engaging the nations. And that's not at odds with us caring well for the church. That's being the church in the city. And then there's the Institute, which is how do we think about heralding the gospel into generations beyond? I believe that's encapsulated in doctrinal formation, in thinking about how do we have a robust approach to biblical languages, how do we have a high value for some people in God's church to have a really strong bent in sound doctrine, to have a full knowledge of Christian history, and to be able to teach that in ways that will replicate over the course of generations. So in a sense, sorry, you got me really passionate, as you can tell. But
I love it.
When I think about the institutional forms of the church, beyond just local fellowships, which are that is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, is to be a part of a local fellowship. It's just more than that as well. And so the way we do the more than that for the city, for the nations, Austin Stone Institute, how are those going to be a fully robust way of thinking about all of God's purposes for his bride in our generation and in the next?
One of the things that I see you guys doing really well when it comes to for the nations is telling the stories of the people that have gone out. You at one time maybe even had a podcast dedicated specifically to that. Do you still?
So that was a series within our Story Teams podcast, but we called it From the Field. Okay. We were planning on doing season 2 at our global gathering this summer, but it was canceled because of COVID. So you'll have to wait until.
What's the global gathering?
We gather all of our international workers together. Basically every 3 years is the desire for us, and we do that to encourage them in the faith, but also to allow them to mutually sharpen one another towards God's purposes in their individual ministries, in their context. So,
how long and where do you meet?
It's
in
usually
Austin
for
or internationally.
Internationally. So we meet internationally, and we gather folks from all over the globe. And what we do is, for about 5 days, we'll worship, we'll preach, and we'll counsel, and we'll care. So
that's so great.
Yeah, the idea is kind of, let's bring the Austin Stone to our goers, and let's provide them with access to things that they maybe struggle to have access to in other places and other ways. So.
Yeah. Well, I think you're already answering the question. My question was, how have you kind of built in this support system, this culture of international missions? I mean, and one of the things that it seemed to me is you tell their stories really well, but it also seems like you're supporting them really well.
Yeah.
Is there other things that you are doing, have done, that you found good results in with opening people's mind to the possibility of going internationally and helping them, think through the decision if they're considering it, and if they go, supporting them and encouraging them? Like, are there some other practical things you guys do that you've seen work really well to that end?
How much time you got?
As much as you do.
So I think there's probably 2 ways of segmenting what we do. There's pre-field preparation, and then there's post-field support. So we're not just going to send anybody who thinks I should be a missionary. We believe deeply that the Holy Spirit sets individuals apart, right? That is very clear throughout Acts, that there are some persons that God sets apart for the task of cross-cultural work. It happens when the church is worshiping and fasting and praying, and we believe that God, by the Holy Spirit, will set apart some people for that task. However, the church needs to affirm that particular calling. The church needs to say, not just have you been called, but yes, we see that calling in your life. We see that you are prepared for what God may be calling you to in the future. And we do that really in kind of two primary ways. We call them disciple-making intensives. We never want to send someone cross-culturally if they haven't been held accountable to a lifestyle of making disciples in their own life. You need to show me that you desire to and will make disciples in the city of Austin before I'm ever comfortable putting you on a plane and saying we're going to send you overseas to do that very thing. So we do that. We do a 10-week kind of group where we're watching. And then from those groups, those are people who said, maybe I'm called. We're going to recruit from there and say, we think you are potentially called and qualified and gifted. And we invite them into a 9-month journey. We call it a Go or Missional community. And the primary things we're doing is keeping those disciple-making rhythms, but we're focusing on their character. It's life on life. It's deeply integrated community. They live in the same neighborhood. They're doing disciple-making tasks. So they're going out and sharing the gospel, like together, doing that together. They're praying together on, typically it's 3 to 4 times a week for these Go or Missional communities. They're doing intercession. They're asking, Lord, move in power. And then they're diving into one another's lives. They're asking really hard questions. So they're getting to see substance, not just desire. The second thing is we're thinking about calling. Who or how might you play a role in a team of people that can help you thrive on the field? So we're asking questions of, man, to what people may God be calling you to? Some people don't have an answer to that question. They're like, I don't know. I just feel like God's moving and send me anywhere. Great, we've got opportunities, you know. Some people would be very precise that God is calling them to, specific people groups that I can't name because it's a public podcast, right? So they would say, no, I know that I'm called to those people, and then we're helping figure out how can we help get you to that place so you can thrive in the task of making disciples there. So that's a 9-month journey for us. And then our elders would look at them and say, okay, you've been through these 2 things. We want to have a conversation with you. We're going to affirm you as a proposed candidate. And then we evaluate them in partnership with a sending agency. So we really do value sending agencies as partners in sending. Particularly Frontiers and Reliant and Pioneers are going to be agencies that we partner with significantly. And they're going to help us not be blind or biased. They're going to say, this is what we see in this candidate. We think they're ready, or we think there's some things they need to address as they go forward. So that's kind of all pre-field stuff. Before they ever get on a plane, they've done those things in evaluation, and then they're going to raise their support. One way of God affirming a calling is to say he'll provide for the needs that you have in ministry and life. And so go work hard on recruiting a team of people who will give financially to you and also generously support you in prayer and intercession. And they're going to be your advocacy team going forward. So we do that. Then there's kind of on the field. What do we do on the field? We still partner with agencies. So we have a long-standing historic relationship with those agencies that I mentioned, and they recognize we as a sending church want to have a real significant role in the lives of those that we have sent. We're not hands-off. We're very hands-on. And we do that through, we have a field office located in Barcelona, Spain, that's staffed with 6 individuals who are called of God to support the work, both in strategy and in care. So we think about care, coaching, and crisis management as the primary role of our field office. They're doing proactive care for our goers, right? At least a monthly check-in for those goers. And then they're doing reactive care if there's an acute need that's felt, if there's team conflict, if there's an issue of sin. They're working in conjunction with me on behalf of our elders to care well for those people. We're doing coaching. We've sent these people for a particular purpose. We're unashamed about the fact that we want to see disciples made and churches planted. We don't just want you present in those peoples, though that's part of ministry. We care that you're staying on the task that God has assigned to you in the season of time you're in, and that you're going to be intentional about daily rhythms, daily habits that are committed to making disciples of Jesus. That matters to us. And so we're going to coach you toward that end. And then, as you're well aware, in international circumstances, we're in less stable environments, and so there are crises that happen all the time, and we're going to have to manage those crises. We had one this summer. It was a pretty significant global event that people will know about, and we had units that were in country, and we had to figure out, are they safe, right? And then it's how do we help care for them in the midst of this crisis, and our church understand what's helpful and what's not helpful right now. And so we're going to do crisis management as well.
When you say what's not helpful right now, what do you mean there?
More often than not, there's a nobility and a desire for people when they hear that folks are suffering internationally to provide care. Oftentimes they miss the nuance and understanding of what's actually helpful in that moment. Presence matters a ton. They're not looking for counsel right now. And in fact, the counsel that a lot of people would give without knowledge of what cross-cultural work looks like can be pretty unhelpful. Oftentimes if people are in danger, the counsel is get out of there. No, we as disciples of Jesus, when there's a moment of opportunity, if we're physically safe, man, let's lean in. Let's figure out how we run towards the crisis, towards the actual disruption that's gone on, and say, what does it look like to minister in the name of Jesus? And so that's, again, it's a hard thing to figure out. How do I help somebody who's serving internationally? And you may not know, if you're just thinking about the fact this is my child or this is my friend,
Right.
what their chosen vocation is and what it looks like for them to thrive in the midst of moments of crisis, and what do we call them to. So that'd be just a simple example.
That makes sense. So you might have someone from the Austin Stone who's in international missions, and they might have a parent or a friend or who is not part of the Austin Stone, doesn't really know much about the culture of the Austin Stone, but still has that relationship with that missionary and is giving them advice contrary to, say, what the plan is all along and the opportunities. You're really contrary to the counsel that the Austin Stone would be giving that missionary at that time. Is that
that's
the
absolutely
version
right.
of what you're
and
saying? Yeah, okay.
They also have team leaders on the field who that's their job. Their job is to lead in these kinds of circumstances.
Sure. Yep.
And so most people think of workers, goers, missionaries, if you want to use that term, as individuals. If they're healthy, they're a part of a team with an authority dynamic who's being led. And for us is to submit ourselves in wisdom to say they've got local leadership who should be called, qualified, and gifted to serve and help them as they navigate this very complex circumstance.
Yeah, it strikes me as of these 142 people, they probably all, or certainly most, well, probably all, were pretty clear on the expectations of Austin Stone and the commitment that they're getting in on the front end and the decision that they're making and the potential ramifications on their being in life and family. If, because, and the expectation is that, look, the first time there's a little bit of challenge or difficulty or maybe even some hints at danger, we don't just leave immediately. Now, there's probably times where you do, right? Where you would help them out of a bad situation. But what I'm driving at is there is a commitment that you guys are asking of these 142 people, an investment, a kind of a clear decision where if this is something we're going to go do, then we're going to go do this and give it all and do it really well. But you have 142. Like you would almost think like, well, to get that many people out doing international missions, you need to set the bar really low and you need to make it really easy. And if there's any kind of difficulty, get them out of there and just kind of this. But there's something in humans that want to do the right thing and they want to be well equipped to do that. That seems to me like what you guys are doing so well is you're helping people see through and have a vision for doing the right thing. And then you also just equip them extremely well to be able to do that. And then you're finding people that rise up and are willing to go make this investment and make this commitment at risk of personal expense. So, I mean, I think that's really commendable.
I think that's the story of the scripture.
Yeah, it is.
God's people throughout history have gone through seasons where they're disobedient. God in his kindness always draws them to repentance, to recovery of his word, to a commitment of covenant fellowship with him, and to the pursuit of the things that he's most passionate about. And so no matter where a church is in engagement in the nations, I personally believe that the Holy Spirit over time will draw them to faithful obedience. Whatever remnant of that people is, there's going to be some. That's why you always find crazy missions people in churches, right? I mean, you're smiling a little bit. You get the sense of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There's always that kind of person. And I think that's because that is a part of God's heart. He will always have people like that. And yes, there's some things that need to be worked on. And yes, there's probably some self-righteousness in that person. Yes, there's better ways they could communicate God's heart. But God's passion, his desire, his aim in this world is to be worshiped amongst every tribe and tongue and nation. That's what he's doing. Oftentimes we think we want more of the presence of God, and the way we're going to get it is by more Christian activity. It's more reading your Bible. It's more time in community and fellowship. It's more time serving. And those are indeed true. But we miss out on the one thing that God is so abundantly clear on. If you want to know where I am, where I'm working, and what I'm about, it's exalting my name among the nations. Mm-hmm. That's like guaranteed what he's up to. So that's why, in many ways, some of those people who are serving Jesus overseas have the most vibrant faith, and they often have the best stories. Mm-hmm. It's because they're where God is working at this time. So,
they are in the path of progress of the gospel.
Yeah,
and it's clearly mandated, and it's also what some of the very first disciples did. I'm just thinking, all those missionary journeys from Paul and so forth. I mean, they set the example. Yeah, it's instructive to me. This is timely. With everything going on sort of stateside and culturally and everything, there's that can take a lot of attention, and rightly so. But this is why it's such a high calling to be in ministry or to be in a local church, right? Because it's not one at the expense of other. It's both and. Mm-hmm. We need to be concerned about the people here in Austin and Texas and those around us in our cultural moment here, but also then internationally. And it does seem like churches tend to have, I guess, strengths maybe a little bit more towards like one or the other. And it's more rare to find churches that have strengths in both. Mm-hmm. So how about other ministry strategies at the Stone that maybe haven't worked, like lessons learned, maybe like strategies you've implemented that haven't worked out so well, and then others that just kind of had like a wind at their back, maybe even surprisingly? Anything come to mind?
I think when you're in a rapid growth church environment, there's a bit of blindness that comes that because you're growing and because resources are coming in, you think everything works.
Okay.
And the reality is it doesn't. Rather than maybe illustrate this with practicality, I'll illustrate it with a principle. Ministries are led by spiritually gifted kinds of leaders. Bottom line, healthy ministries are led by healthy leaders. And unhealthy ministry, unhealthy forms of ministry are oftentimes led by unhealthy people. And so if I were going to say what's one practical thing as we think about leadership across ministry strategies at the Austin Stone, when leaders were healthy, ministries were often healthy. When leaders are unhealthy, that's when we start to see particular forms of decline. So, I think anytime I see for lack of better words, a lack of performance, that's the first question. I'm going straight to the leader and saying, hey, what's going on? Let's talk. It would seem as if there's a lack of, progress, there's a lack of joy, there's a lack of clarity, there's a lack of charity. Let's talk about what's going on and why you think that's the case. Because more often than not, the healthier the leader, the healthier the ministry, they just need some help figuring out how do I take where I am and help other people come around this, not just with vision, but with actual substance. Mm-hmm. So I think one specific area that COVID revealed for the Stone was groups. So we're very good at Sunday fellowship. We had a strong groups system, but we didn't have strong investment in the leadership of those group leaders in particular. And so when COVID hit and you can't do Sundays anymore, groups are what you have. Mm-hmm. And it was a mad scramble to realize we don't have the invested leaders in our group system and structure. We don't have the support mechanisms to make sure we're communicating or resourcing those people very effectively. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done as we go forward. And I'm pleased that over the course of the summer and into this fall, that's a lot of what we've done. Let's make sure that we are deeply invested in, our small group structure at the Stone. So I would say that's one tactical example of something we didn't pay attention to and didn't have leadership and therefore needed investment significantally.
Did you move some leadership resources around kind of in-house that maybe you had some leaders focused on some other things and you took them off of that and kind of applied them towards groups? Or how did you make new hires, or how did you resource groups?
This is a question you should ask Kevin tomorrow.
Okay.
How did you lead change in COVID? Because he did it brilliantly.
Okay. I'll do it.
Essentially, we have a pretty big, staffing organization at this point, and Kevin led a massive pivot in a very short period of time to focus our Sunday-based teams, our congregation staff teams, on specific areas. We basically focused on how are we going to connect people in the season to one another. Like, that was massive emphasis. how are we going to help them grow in their faith? And so classroom environments, virtual-based learning, resourcing. We had a team that switched and did just that. We're going to care well for the body and for our city. And so we had 2 congregational teams who took the lion's share of benevolence internally, and then also mercy and justice and service in our city externally. We raised like $750,000 and were able to give that generously to various different ministries in the city of Austin over the course of COVID, which is awesome. Mm-hmm. What's more awesome is that we did it in an embodied way that led to relationships with people over time. Mm-hmm. Like Steve Tang, our local mission director, did a phenomenal job of helping lead our South and our West congregations to care well for our city and for our people. So those are some examples, of mm-hmm. ways in which change was demanded and then change was led.
Yeah.
It was bumpy.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. It was really bumpy.
Of course.
But in God's kindness, I think we weathered a lot of those bumps and were able to serve and pivot very quickly to respond.
What are some of the biggest cultural or societal or theological or political challenges you guys are dealing with at
one in every category?
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. But does anything kind of rise to the top of your mind now?
Yeah, I mean, the conversation around race and racial justice has certainly been a challenging one to navigate for our body, because in the moment in time that we had from March to about May, so much of that conversation accelerated quickly, and it was dominated by voices that were not ours, mm-hmm. For our body in particular. So I think we have learned how to speak on particular issues, especially the issue of race, in a way that is both unifying and charitable, but at the same time prophetic and challenging. And when you speak like that, that creates opportunity to care, but also opportunity for hurt. And we've had to work really hard to respond well to individuals who were hurt by some of the things that we said. Mm. And 2, it's revealed one of the uniquenesses of being a multi-congregational church in a city like Austin. Our urban core congregation downtown had very different responses and questions to race and racial justice than our Northwest congregation did, which is located, near to Cedar Park and has a much more suburban feel to it. Mm-hmm. So I would say it's been fun for me, mm-hmm. Because we get to see different pockets of our city respond differently to the conversation on race, but it's given us opportunity to say, how do we lead with the truths of God's word, and also with practical applications of what that means for us as people through the leaders that God has appointed in a way that's healthy and helpful over time.
Yeah.
So, man, that conversation has been challenging. There's been moments of contentiousness. But I think overall, what I've been pleased with is that we have spoken slowly, but we have still spoken.
Mm-hmm. And when you spoke, was it across, say, the pulpit, so to speak, on a Sunday morning? Was it through getting messages out other ways? How did you address the issue?
So we issued a special statement, in a sense, which is on behalf of our elders, this is what we believe about racial justice, and also attached a little bit to this is what it means in this cultural moment. So you can go to, I think it's austinstone.org/racial justice, and that'll give you a sense.
Is this a video? Is this a blog post?
It's both a video and it's a document. So in a sense, we took weeks together just wrestling with how are we going to say this and who are we going to say it, or who are we going to have say it on our behalf. So Ross Lester, our pastor of preaching, Andre Gray, our South Congregation pastor, and Steve Tang, our local mission director, all spoke on behalf of all of our elders to say these are the things we believe, and this is what it means in this moment for us as a fellowship. So, and then we have addressed race, previously, prior to this moment in the pulpit several times, as well as we're now thinking about how do we talk about it in the context of the Austin Stone, not nationally, in the context of the Austin Stone, how are we going to speak to racial justice? So those are the ways we've talked about it, but more important is what are we doing? I'm a man of action. People talk all day long. Can you, in substance, back up what you're saying by action? So I've been really proud of our leadership to do a couple of things. One, we have deliberately sought to listen to persons of color who are pastors and leaders in our city. That's been a dispositional posture for us to listen and to learn to co-laborers in the gospel.
Outside of the Stone?
Outside of the Stone.
Okay.
So we've taken very intentional steps in that regard, and Some informal and then some in informal settings, but we've done that aspect of things too. Is we've pursued an outside organization to audit us on our cultural competency, and we're in the process of working through a clear, sober external assessment that will allow us a pathway forward of saying what are some of the goals that we believe God is calling us to in response to where we currently are.
Oh, wow. Can you share who that organization is that's doing an audit on you?
Yeah, it's the Institute for Cross-Cultural Mission. They're out of the Grace Institute in Washington, D.C. Reverend Dr. Erwin Ince is the primary leader of that. Melissa Littlepage is their, I think, CEO. They're helping us work through an assessment using the Intercultural Development Inventory, which is a sociological tool that just gives us awareness of both our actual and perceived abilities in thinking cross-culturally and acting cross-culturally. And then our team will have the opportunity to say, in light of what we have learned, let's think through a pathway forward for us to grow in our competency to think and to act cross-culturally.
And this assessment, do they have some kind of people show up on a Sunday morning unawares and be talking to leaders and talking to different members of the congregation? I'm just assuming they kind of saturate themselves into the culture and then come back with an assessment?
We primarily think through leadership first. And so rather than going to the body, we're starting with us.
I see.
We think if God's going to change anything, it's going to be first through those who he's called to lead in his body. And so we wanted to start there with how do our elders and our staff particularly see themselves and what are their competency levels in this area. So we're going to take some steps forward after we assess ourselves and then think about how do we lead the body in light of what we learn.
How about things you're most excited about both at the Austin Stone and at the church at large, kind of as you survey where the greater church is, but then also at the Stone, I'm just curious kind of where you see the hope or where you see the brightest future, where you see evidences of grace or things you're excited about.
I think the metaphor that I've used for this season of the Austin Stone is God is pruning us. Matt Carter, our founding pastor, love him dearly as a brother in Christ. God called him away. And that's both a brother faithfully fulfilling the Spirit's leadership and his calling, and it's an organization, in a sense, losing its founder. Founder changes are difficult. They provide an opportunity for awareness in ways in which founders shape an organization. And I think we're learning a lot of those lessons right now. And so God is pruning our leadership team in some specific ways that I think are for his purposes. And God is pruning the Austin Stone more broadly through COVID and through all the things we've encountered over this last year. And I think what it's doing is pressing genuine transformation and holiness into the lives of our people and also pressing them to own their own discipleship. If not anything else, COVID has forced the people of God to not rely on forms of church for their nourishment. They've had to press in and recognize my maturity in the faith, my discipleship really is owned by me. I think that's very pruning. And so I think we'll come out of COVID with a deeper sense of ownership of our partners in particular over their own discipleship in the life of the church. And I think pruning prepares for greater fruitfulness. I really do.
Yeah.
I think that's what God is doing in this season, at least in our church, in our leadership, and in our people, is saying, I want to prune you, and it's going to be painful.
Yeah.
But I'm doing it so that you will bear fruit in keeping with repentance and in being attentive to what the Holy Spirit produces and in terms of ministry and mission into the future.
Yeah.
I so deeply believe that's what he's doing right now.
Yeah.
More broadly speaking, the Big C church, the global church, that's a hard one. I think I have conversations with people all over the world, but that's just a really broad brush to paint with. I would say the one thing that I think is a unique opportunity is there's not a single part of this earth that COVID has not touched. And when people have a common experience of suffering, it's an opportunity for us to connect and specifically connect with them with the gospel of hope. Everybody has a story of how COVID impacted their life. The question for us as believers is, how can we use that experience to be a testimony of God's faithfulness and to share the good news in ways that are unprecedented? Really. Like, when is the last time there was a global event that everybody, no matter where they are, can talk about? And how that impacted them personally?
Yeah.
So I see that as just like opportunity. The church should be poised and ready. Like, churches that are hunkering down right now, I totally understand. But lean in and think about the global opportunity you have right now to witness to the goodness of God. He's the only person who gives us hope in the midst of suffering.
Yeah.
He's the only hope that we have. Let's present that as a hope that the world desperately needs to hear.
Yep.
Not just that gets us through another day of isolation, not
Yes.
just that gets us through another bad news cycle. Let's be poised and ready to testify to the goodness of God in the midst of suffering.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this, and thank you so much for coming by. This was quite a privilege.
Yeah,
really
super fun.
enjoyed this. I'd like to ask you for final thoughts for the listeners, but before that, I won't ask you to kind of go in depth on parenting, but I really do. I am curious. So your oldest is, you said 13?
Yep.
My oldest is 10. He had an assessment this morning. One great thing about virtual school is you can do it from Austin, Texas, as well as you can from Nashville. So he came along for the week, which was great. Yeah. And your youngest is 5, and you have 3 boys and 2 girls. We have the same. And I'm curious, though, if you were going back, say 10, call it even 5 or 10 years. I'm sure when you get to this, did you find when you got to like the 5 years leading up to the 13-year-old that's almost like the equivalent of a greater period of time? Like, is there a lot that happens in that period of time from, say, 9 to 13? So going back in time, say 5, 7, 10 years, what would be your advice to Todd and his wife back then? Some parenting advice if you're going back in time a little bit.
I think my wife and I have talked about it. One of the blessings of having 5 kids is a recognition of how you've changed as a parent. And so our oldest, Micah, has fundamentally different parents than our youngest, Lucy. God sanctified us.
For the better, right?
Yeah, Lord willing, you
Right.
know. But also there's more kids in our house. So Lucy gets less attention than Micah got as well. You know? So it's a recognition that we are different parents for each of our kids. We have the blessing of having a lot of, folks in our community who are having their, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, even 5th child right now. And so we've had a lot of these kinds of conversations. So I would say, looking back, what I would say is know yourself as a parent, and then know how that actually impacts your child. I am a hard-charging, high-demand, ambitious, pretty impatient individual. I think I knew that about myself 5, 8, 10 years ago. But what I didn't know is how that would impact each one of my kids differently. My oldest is a lot like me, and that creates opportunity for conflict, but it creates opportunity for alignment. And so it's super fun pressing Micah. Man, like, he's playing 3 different sports, and he's just all in on everything that he does, and I'm so proud and I can push him. Our second could not be farther from Micah. He's mild-mannered, he's meek, he's humble, he's caring, he's kind. And the way that my intensity impacted Hudson is different than the way that it impacted Micah. And recognizing I need to be self-aware as a parent, but I also need to pay particular attention to how myself impacts the people that are around me would be just a general principle of parenting.
Yeah. How do you handle the concern of getting one-on-one time, enough of one-on-one time with each of the kids when you have 5?
Honestly, I've said this. One of the blessings of having a big family is that you think like a big family, and your economy of family time changes. So our primary economy, for lack of better words, is making sure that Olivia and I have a thriving marriage. That's priority number 1. And so if you're going to ask individual time, I prioritize it with my wife, because my kids will be blessed by a husband and a wife who love each other desperately and are aligned in our purpose to shepherd this little flock that we have. With 5, honestly, it's really hard. I have a demanding job 5 days a week with all the sports that we have. Like, individual time comes as you are going, not necessarily as much as we plan for those individual things. And so I take opportunities like picking kids up from soccer or football or dance as moments where I can have individual conversation around how you're doing. So, hey, tell me, what does prayer look like for you? Simple question to ask. And you'll get a lot of response if you're one-on-one in the car and they're in the back seat. You're not trying to teach them. You're not trying to coach them. You're just asking sincere questions, but taking advantage of those one-on-one opportunities when you have them is probably the disposition. So
yeah, I mean, that was my parents' strategy. I mean, my dad died when I was 10, but what I remember about him, I remember him very, very well, and he took us along to stuff. Like, that was how we got to spend time. And it was great. Like, it was not, it was clear, and I know I've said this before, but it was clear that the kids were not the center focus of the family, and the parents were just around serving the kids and doing whatever they wanted. Rather, the parents were on a mission, and we got to ride along with it. It was awesome. Yeah. I didn't feel like I had lost, anything. We went to work a lot. We jumped in the truck a lot. Like, we just went along, and it was great.
I think that's a interesting. So we've talked about this as well, having a parent-centered home versus a child-centered home. That's been a consistent source of just challenge for Living Now. We've deliberately chosen to be a parent-centered home. We want our kids to see our healthy marriage, and we want them to see us living out purposeful mission in the context of community and everyday life, which means we say no to some things that many of their peers in school would have said yes to. And the rhythms that we keep are different than some of their peers. Just really honestly, that's been a source of just struggle with guilt for both Olivia and I, is are we making the right decision in being a parent-centered home? We try very hard to invest in our children. We try to be very disciplined about their discipleship and about their formation as collective group and as individuals, as boys and girls as well. But we're not a kid-centered home.
Yes. We have the same thoughts of guilt from time to time as well. Yeah. What do you think's going on with that?
I mean, I think it's more normative to have kid-centered families in suburban America. It is a nuclear family-centric culture, and we do want the best for our children, and we have a society that has enabled a lot of that to be the driving impulse and impetus for how you find identity and purpose. Mm-hmm. So I would say that that's kind of the cultural water we're swimming in middle-class suburban America.
Yeah.
And so it feels guilty when you deliberately choose a countercultural approach to parenting or to life as a family. It's weird.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think for us too, sometimes the guilt comes from because we are getting too parent-centric. A little bit maybe too selfish sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So I know we have that ability within us. Last question, and I ask it because I feel like I have the most room for improvement here. But do you have daily disciplines or cadences with the family that you have found to be helpful?
So we talk about seasons and rhythms. So in certain seasons, we're going to emphasize different rhythms. So rather than thinking about daily cadences, we're thinking about in this season, we're just exiting one and entering into another. So the fall season for us is kid activity. So our rhythms in this time are, in order to enjoy family time and in order to enjoy devotion together, means it's going to be less time because we're investing in faithful presence and engagement in these activities, right? So we're going to be doing, the school bus approach, which is there are 4 different practices. We got to figure out the Tetris to get all these kids to one different place or another. So family meal times and prayers of family around meal times diminish. That means we're going to adapt rhythms in the season that is to come. Christmas, all the sports season is over right now. Christmas is a season where we invest intentionally in family rhythms. And so Advent and family presence, dinner together, those disciplined forms of prayer take prominence in a season like we have currently. So that's kind of been the principle we've operated on as a family, is what season are we in, what rhythms are we going to have, and then adapting those rhythms in seasons to respond to need.
That's super helpful. Is that something you guys came up with? Or is that something you heard or read somewhere?
I don't have source material in my head.
Okay.
But most of my ideas were sourced from somewhere else.
Sure. But it's also in part the way your brain works, right? Yeah. So it wouldn't be inconceivable that kind of landing on that seasons and rhythms thing is just something that kind of occurred to you at some point and stuck.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's extremely helpful. I really like that. Well, great.
Yeah.
Final thoughts for the listeners.
Oh, man. I think anytime I'm in a public media forum, I get a little uncomfortable because I'm not with the person I'm talking to. Obviously, I'm talking to you right now, but whoever's listening, I feel like if I've contributed anything to your faith, I just want to admonish you that that's something that the Holy Spirit is doing, not something I'm doing, and you need to be sensitive to the Holy Spirit's prompting. if I've said something that is unhelpful or uncharitable or unkind or just wrong, strike it from your mind. Please, by no means, feel obligated to take anything that I say as something that would be binding on your conscience. And so part of the reason I say that is I've unintentionally hurt people in the past by things that I've said in public forums. I would just hate for one of your listeners to be unintentionally hurt by something I said flippantly.
Yeah.
So
I don't think you have anything to worry about, to be honest. They're welcome to send me an email to the can'tlappodcast@gmail.com if you have offended anyone. But I appreciate you saying that. But this was fun.
Yeah.
And it was helpful. And it was a privilege. Thanks, Todd. Appreciate it.
Thank you, my friend, for having me. It was a blast.
Very much. Best wishes to you and the Austin Stone. I'm looking forward to Kevin being on tomorrow. And I'll be following you. I'll be following along from Nashville and cheering you guys on.
Appreciate that,
Thanks
man.
for being on the podcast.
Yeah, glad to do it.